This is my game, Slaughter Cats, a 1 to 4 player beat 'em up platformer coming to PC and hopefully Xbox and PlayStation. I started developing my game around 4 years ago in Unity.
I'd made some basic games before in Unity at uni, and as I initially wanted the game to use 2D sprites on a 3D plane similar to most beat 'em ups, I thought Unity would be good for this.
After a few months, I've built the basic framework for lots of mechanics including lives, XP, magic, health, dealing damage, taking damage, doing attacks, a map, a blacksmith menu system where within the blacksmith menu system you could buy attacks and buy new spells and equip those, an armor system where you could equip different armor to different parts of the body which would affect how much damage you would take and other attributes, and you could also buy different weapons and equip those, and they would all have different stats which would affect damage dealt and critical hit chance and other attributes as well. I also spent a lot of time working on the menu systems, as it can be quite complicated to get all the sub-menus and level transitions working properly.
I eventually began experimenting more with platforming, but soon came to the realization that platforming with 2D sprites on a 3D plane was extremely difficult, as it was very difficult to judge whether the character was properly lined up with the platform. On top of this, I was very aware that the graphics weren't very good due to my poor art skills, and knew for almost all games graphics are really important, and if you have poor graphics, people would be unlikely to even look at the game. I thought about paying someone to do art for my game, but I still wasn't confident in the game, so didn't really want to spend thousands of pounds on something which could potentially go nowhere. My game at this stage was 8 months into development, but I felt given the look of the game and issues with platforming, it wasn't going to be a success, so I slowly stopped working on the game. After a few months I had the idea to try again, but this time use 3D meshes instead of 2D sprites, as this would allow for the platforming to work and meant I didn't have to rely on my drawing skills for art. As I was using 3D this time, I decided to experiment with Unreal Engine and see whether I would be able to make something with Unreal instead, as I knew Unreal Engine generally have for much better looking games out of the box, and I feel like that is key to getting people to even look at your game. After a few weeks of experimenting with the standard 3D template in Unreal Engine 4.26, I knew I wanted to use Unreal Engine as the graphics were good straight away, and they had a lot of tools and plugins which worked straight out of the box, and also I liked the blueprints after a bit of getting used to them. I'd previously been writing the game in C# in Unity, and found it quite difficult to manage, as I'd often go back to classes I created weeks earlier, and I had to spend time going over my code again to figure out exactly what I'd done. For bug fixing in Unity as well, I found it very difficult to follow all the references through to different classes and try to debug all the issues. Whereas with blueprints in Unreal, I found it much easier to read what was going on quickly, and it was generally easy to use. I thought using a fully 3D approach worked much better for beat 'em up platformers, and I'd managed to create a very basic gameplay mechanic where you could kill enemies and they could kill you in just a few weeks. I went through many tutorials mainly on YouTube, trying to build some basic AI, and eventually managed to get something which worked in quite a basic fashion using Unreal's behaviour trees. I then began to try and make a basic cat character using the default Unreal Engine skeleton as the basis, which looked okay to start with, but I decided to attach a skeletal mesh tail and a limbic groom whiskers to give it more character. Both these components caused many issues due to physics issues, and eventually had to give up on the Alembic groom whiskers as I had so many performance issues with them and was wasting far too much time just trying to fix problems. In the end, I decided to give up and just use static planes instead. Not quite as interesting, but saved me many headaches. I also spent a large amount of time trying to get the fur texture right for the cat characters. I experimented with many styles, trying hair cards, but the result didn't look all that good, probably due to my art skills, and also there were issues with stretching due to weight paints, which like many issues can take large amounts of time to perfect, so I just gave up with that, and after a fair bit of experimentation, came up with a texture that I was reasonably happy with. I'm still not 100% on these characters, as they do look goofy and amateurish, and don't necessarily fit with the rest of the game and the environments, but in some ways I do like that. They're out of place and stand out in that respect. I will consider it more as I go through development and may either spend even more time reworking the models and textures, or I might pay someone to redo the models and textures. After getting a basic character set up, I began to work on the camera. I want to have a typical camera viewpoint used in side-scrolling beat-em-ups, whereby the background is framed and the floor of the fighting area is also viewable, while allowing a wide enough focus so that the player could see the multiple enemies around them.
I made the camera adjustable for when there are multiple players playing the game, so players can move around a bit more freely and so they can fight further apart.
I also had to build in a system to stop the players from going outside the camera view, as I'm building this game to allow up to 4 players. I didn't want players to be able to go outside the camera view and get lost. This ended up taking quite a long time, like most things with game dev. They're never as simple as they seem. The characters would still pass through walls in certain situations, so I had to build a few mechanics to act as a workaround, and this still has some issues to this day and will probably require more work in the future, but for the time being it seems good enough. I also played around with the camera switching positions during certain larger platforming sections, and after a lot of experimentation came up with a view similar to the standard view but zoomed out more, which allowed the player to see further ahead and allowed players to be in different sections if there was more than one player.
Blood is an important part of my game, as I wanted to really match the name Slaughtercats. I really like hyper-violent games like Mortal Kombat and wanted to add a lot of blood to my game in a similar way, and also like the contrast of a very violent game and cats which are typically considered cute. I watched lots of YouTube videos, and after weeks of experimentation using cascade effects, I finally came up with something I liked. As the game progressed, I added extra Niagara effects and decals to improve the look, and I will likely iterate on the current effects further as my game progresses, as I still see room for improvement.